Good evening, the erudite speaker for the day, Sanichan, Mathew, Madhavath, and the audience for the day, they are members. Today we are here once again with another program of SIRC, a webinar discussion on SA's 600 series, 600, 610 and 620. These will deal with the dependence of other auditors' works, internal auditors' works, and the experts' opinions. So how these should be made use of in this attempt to do the process of auditing, and what are the standards that expect of us, or the aspects that are being discussed with us. Today we have with us the erudite speaker, Sanichan Mathew Madhavath sir. A warm welcome to you, sir, for this evening's program. And also, I very warmly welcome all the members on behalf of SIRC in the capacity of Vice Chairmanship of SIRC. Today, the responsibility of conducting this webinar is bestowed on me by my chairman, Mr. Chinnamastan, and in the absence of the secretary, Mr. Naresh Chandragelli. So with these opening remarks, I welcome you all to the very interesting and very important topic that is being discussed. And I know most of the members are busy already with the branch bank audits, the statutory audit for 21-22, but there also this topic is very relevant, if I am right with the speaker. So before I'm handing out the proceedings to the speaker, I would take the opportunity of introducing the speaker for you. He is a very erudite personality and a proud member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, and he was former partner in Deloitte and Touch and PricewaterhouseCoopers Kuwait, and he became fellow member in the year 1989. So career summary is 28 years of experience as auditor in Kuwait in two big four accounting firms, from 93 to 2010 in PwC, and from 2010 to 2021 in Deloitte. Expert working knowledge of IFRS and ISA, engaged in the audit of large Kuwait banks, telecom operators companies, insurance companies, investment companies, etc. And there was advisory series for implementation of IFRS 9 models and processes. And non-audit services provided include due diligence services, valuations, financial feasibility reviews, etc. Learning and experience education side, he has experience of over 25 years at PwC and Deloitte at the Middle East regional level. Topics handled by him include accounting standards, IFRS, auditing standards, etc. Other highlights are he was speaker on technical subjects at professional bodies, the resource person at regional training events of the firm, and reviewer quality assurance evaluations within the regional firm. Former chairman of the Kuwait chapter of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Very happy to know that, sir. Founding secretary of the Kuwait chapter, former member of Rotary International, widely traveled, visited about 50 countries. So with your rich experience and your wisdom of knowledge, we're all very eager to hear you, sir. Once again, a warm welcome to you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ponnaraj. Okay. Good evening, my colleagues in the profession. I hope I am quite audible to you all. I am very thankful to the SIRC, the chairman, the vice chairman, and the other members for giving me this opportunity to talk to my fraternity. Today, as the vice chairman mentioned, I will be speaking on three important standards: 600, 610, and 620. If you notice, these are very special standards because These standards talk about how we as auditors use the work of other people. In all the other standards, essays, it is dealing with how we do the audit work. But it is here in these three standards, they are talking about how we use the work that somebody else has done. So 600 is talking about how we use the work of other auditors, which means basically the competent auditors in the case of a holding company. Then it talks about 610 talks about how we use the work of internal auditor, and 620 talks about how we use the work of an expert. So I'll go one by one, starting with 610. And at the end of the presentation, I'm told that it is at the end of the presentation that we will an opportunity to interact. You can ask questions, and I'll be only happy to give my response to you. So here we start on ISA 600. So I have a few questions. I think all of you have these similar questions as you approach this subject, this standard, because it talks about using the work of another auditor. Who is that another auditor? How do you identify that another auditor? Then the question comes up, when does the external auditor use the work of another auditor? What are required to be performed by the external auditor for using the work of another auditor? What is the extent of reliance on the work of another auditor? Can he scope out any component from the procedures that he has to perform? Are there disclosures required of such reliance? Because we are relying on the work of another auditor. How does the principal auditor conclude and report on the parent's consolidated financial information? You must understand, if you go back and look at the standard itself, you see the standard became effective from 1st of April 2002. 1st of April 2002. Now it is exactly 20 years since this standard has been in force. See, it's a long time, 2 decades. Actually, if you compare it with the international standards in auditing, again the same 600, it has completely changed from what it was many years back. Right now, the international standards in auditing has the caption, special considerations, audit of group financial statements, including the work of competent auditor. So they have changed the name of another auditor to competent auditor to be more precise. And now they are using the word audit of group financial statements. So there are changes compared to what we have in India and what is being adopted under ISA in other countries where ISA is adopted. So that is just a different, just a change, important information that I wanted to give you. But we will now focus on our standards in auditing that is applicable in our country, in India. See, before we proceed, I think we need to be very clear about a couple of terms. First is about the principal auditor. Who is the principal auditor? That's a definition there. He is the auditor who reports on the financial information of entity that includes the financial information of one or more of its components. So if you are a holding company, if you are a parent company with other subsidiaries and you are the auditor of that parent company, which has got subsidiaries or branches or joint ventures, etc., then you are the principal auditor because there are other subsidiaries under your client, your entity, and then they may have other auditors also. Then another auditor is the auditor who is responsible for reporting the financial information of the components. So the term component, what is the term component? Component is a division, branch, joint venture, subsidiary, etc. of whose financial information is included in the financial information reported by the principal auditor. So it is not very difficult to understand this. Basically, we understand that we are talking about an entity which has got subsidiaries, joint ventures, branches, etc. And therefore, whoever is the auditor of such an entity is called the principal auditor. He is also referred to as parent auditor in some cases. That is about the principal auditor. Then we have got another auditor. Another auditor is the auditor who audits any of the components of the main entity, where his the financial statements that he audits are generally consolidated into the financial statements of the parent company. So if you are auditing a subsidiary or other company, and you know that those financial statements are going to be consolidated into that of the parent company, then you must be aware that you are another auditor, and therefore you have certain responsibilities with regard to the work that you do and with regard to the requirements of the parent auditor. Then components I have already explained. I think when we talk about components, it is not very easy to identify a component. Many cases it is easy, like when it is a subsidiary, we know it is the component. When it is a JV with the parent having the partnership or the ownership, it is a component. But what about branches? What about branches of an entity, like the bank audits which we do? Is it a component or is it a part of the entity itself? How you have to identify whether it is a component or not is basically looking at whether that particular component or the entity that we think is a component is issuing or preparing separate financial statements. So that is the first and most important matter to be looked into. Is it preparing separate financial statements? And is it generally a separate legal entity? Generally, such components will be also separate legal entities, and usually they will have a separate management. So now when it comes to, let us talk about the branch audit of a bank, it is very clear that they have separate financial statements. They issue separate financial statements, and therefore such branches are considered as components. And there are several other cases where you will see subsidiaries, joint ventures, which are independent. They independently prepare their financial statements and send it to their parent company, where the parent company will be consolidating those financial statements. So all such entities are called components. Now, what about a company having 5 factories across different states in India? The factories are located in 5 different states, but those factories basically are into production, and they have a local accountant or a resident accountant who compiles the financial information, who will talk about the revenue, who will account the revenue, who will account the expenses and assets and liabilities, and then send a trial balance to the head office. Let us say he will send a trial balance. He may also send a management account to the head office. And basically all these are managed, if they are all managed at the head office level and no separate financial statement is prepared at the entity, at the factory level, then you cannot say that factory is a component. It is just a factory. And therefore, what is most important is to see if there are separate financial statements being issued, whether there is a management having authority over the preparation of the financial statements, and you can also look at the legal status of the entity. So we have understood who is a principal auditor, who is the other auditor under this standard, and what is a component, and the relation between how to identify a component. Now we will move to the next topic. See, the standard is very clear about when we can accept, the external audit can accept the position as the principal auditor. I'm talking about when you are going to be appointed as the principal auditor, you have to look at a couple of things before you really accept it. One is, you must understand what is the extent of your participation in the complete audit, the consolidated financial statements. Let us say the entity that is appointing you as the principal auditor has, let us say, 3 subsidiaries in different countries, 1 in India and the 2 others are outside of India. Then you have to understand, and you understand also, you understand from the company that there are separate auditors for each of these entities, for the entity in India and for the 2 entities outside India. So therefore, the question that is to be asked first of all is, what will be the extent of my participation in these audits? because the audits of components are being done by different auditors. So what do I do? Can I have some hold on these audits? Will I be able to participate in the audit, in the preparation of financial statements? So that is the first question you have to ask. Then ideally, you must ensure that you have a material portion of you are involved in the audit of a material portion of the financial statements. Suppose there is an entity which is like a parent company which does not have any activity, very minimum activity, but it has got 3 very large subsidiaries, investment companies, a factory, or whatever. So they have got 3 large subsidiaries, but then the head office or the parent has very limited activity. And each of these 3 subsidiaries are audited by separate auditors, or in our term, other auditors. Will you be ready to take up this audit? It is a question we have to ask, because like I told you, this external auditor's extent of participation in this audit will be very limited, and therefore he has to really consider whether he can take up this audit. And also, apart from the extent of participation, he must also have sufficient knowledge of the business of the components. He must ask questions to the parent company management and obtain sufficient knowledge about the business of those components, which is very important. And he must also, by understanding the business and operations, he must also get some understanding of the risk of material statement in those financial statements. For example, let us say this company, we have a bank in India. You are appointed as a principal auditor, and there is a bank in, let us say, a country called Tunisia or in Algeria or whatever, where you are not sure about how those banking operations are done, what is the level of supervision by the regulator, and therefore you may have a question on what is the risk I am taking. Are they well-regulated banks? Is it fine for me? Will they have proper risk management? And will I be getting into trouble if I take up the audit of this entity which has got subsidiaries in these kind of countries? And therefore, you have to look at the risk of material misstatement before you accept it. You need to be comfortable about the risk of material misstatement. Of course, every audit there will be a risk of material misstatement, but the depth, the seriousness of the risk is what you need to consider. And also, it is also important, we know that all these subsidiaries will have its own auditors, but there may be cases where you may not be very happy or comfortable with the work that they have done. Even though you had instructed them to do X, Y, and Z work, you may not be comfortable that they have done the works properly. And in which case, it is required of you under the standard to step in and do additional procedures to get a comfort. But in every case, they may not allow you. There may be laws in certain countries where they will not allow a third party from another country, let us say particularly from another country, to come and look into the books of the company. It happens in many countries. And therefore, before you take up this audit, you need to also understand whether in a circumstance, in a situation, you will be able to do additional procedures if required. So all these matters must be considered before you decide on taking up the audit of the parent company or to accept the role as principal auditor. Then the question is, should the principal auditor scope in all components of the parent entity? Let us say a parent has 6 entities of different sizes, and some are very minor, small entities. So the question is whether you should scope them in for the purpose of this audit and particularly application of this ISA. The answer is not necessary. If the principal auditor concludes then the size of the component is not material to the overall size of the combined entities, the consolidated financial statements, then he is not required to apply the standard SA 600 for those components. But just excluding is not enough. We must document why we have excluded that. There must be enough reasons. We must say total size is so much, of the entity is parent entity is so much, and this comes to only very minuscule, maybe 3% or 4% of the total assets of the combined entity, and therefore there is every reason for you to exclude it. But at the same time, if take the case of a parent with 14 subsidiaries, each subsidiary is just above average. Maybe it has got 5 to 10%. Each one has 5 to 10% of the assets of the entity, of the parent entity. In that case, everything, each one may be small, but at the same time, together they are a big component, and therefore you cannot scope them out. You will have to perform procedures required under ISA 600. But at the same time, I just want to let you know that the audit carried out jointly is not covered by this standard, which everybody understands. We have got a separate standard for joint audit, and therefore this standard does not apply for joint audits. Now, before we accept, I told you we need to look at certain things: size, the materiality, everything has been seen, and whether we are able to work additional, perform additional procedures if needed. All these things we have seen, and let us say we are going to accept the audit. And then once you accept the audit, what are the things that you need to do? I have segregated them into what you have to do at the acceptance and planning level, and what you have to do at the finalization stage. So at the acceptance and planning level, like we earlier said, we have to understand the business risk in relation to the entity's business operations, information. How do you get this? Understand the business and the risk. This information can be obtained from the public domain. It can be obtained with discussions with the management and discussions with the component auditor. So this is very important. It is very important to understand the business and the risk. I already mentioned in the previous slide that we need to understand the business operations and their related risk. This is important. Now, ideally, he must have a planning meeting with the component auditor. That planning meter, in the planning meter, he must ask many questions. He must have a big agenda to ask separate questions to the component auditor. First of all, he need to understand a little bit the background about the engagement part, about the firm, the engagement partner of the component, and the management and the team members, whether they have sufficient qualification, whether they have experience in the particular industry in which the component is. This information you must gather. We must also understand a little in detail about the operations of the entity, about the key management people, whether they are experienced people. What about their integrity? Were there questions about the integrity in the past? Then we need to ask the component auditor, what is his take on the key risk in that component? Because he may have a better understanding of the component, and he may be able to make a better judgment about the key risk in that entity. Then you can also ask him what is his take on the control environment in that entity. We need to also ask the auditors, the competent auditors, about their independence. And here I want to just add something more. In the case of an auditor appointed in India, who will be a chartered accountant, this question does not arise because he is expected to have complied with the independence rules. Then we will also ask the competent auditor about the regulatory environment. These are all matters we ask at the beginning of the audit to give us a better understanding. Who is regulating? Is there any regulator regulating this entity? If we get a positive answer, it gives us a comfort that things are being monitored. So that is one thing. Then we need to also discuss with him the procedures that are planned, what is the materiality that we are assigning, what is the audit approach that we will implement, what will be the nature, extent of audit, what will be the timing of the audit. All these matters we'll have to also identify what are the significant issues in any previous year. In the previous year, if he was an auditor in the previous year also, we can ask him, did you come across any significant audit issues? Then we need to also understand what were the significant estimation and judgment involved in that entity. Then we can ask him, what about management letters? Did you issue any management letter and how was it treated? Did the entity positively look at it and make corrections wherever our suggestions were, wherever he gave the suggestions? And we need to also discuss about the timetable of the audit. And that timetable has to synchronize with the timetable of the parent company, because you need to get the financial statements from the component auditor in time so that you can complete the audit of the parent company. So we have to ask him and agree on a timetable. We have to also request him for an early warning memo. Ideally, we must always ask the component auditor to alert us in case they come across certain issues. They don't have to wait till the end of the audit to let us know about those issues. He must alert us about this, any matter which is called an early warning memo. He should send an early warning memo to the principal auditor, alerting him about any issues. So this we have to tell him in advance, please send us a early warning memo. And then if there are other deliverables that the parent requires, that the parent auditor requires, he must also inform them at this time. Now, at this point, I just want to also tell you that generally there is a practice of issuing an audit questionnaire to the component auditor. This has been always there, but in the last 5-7 years, I have not come across many auditors issuing this questionnaire. They rather visit, because particularly under ISA regime, most auditors, if it is a major component, visit them and get information directly. But in many cases, of course, there is a questionnaire being issued to the component auditor, asking him all about the component, its risk, and how they dealt with each of the line items as part of their audit. So if that is what you want to do, you must always tell them in advance that you will be sending them a questionnaire, and you expect them to complete that questionnaire by so and so date. Now, one more thing I want to let you know. When is it that you think we must get these responses? Is it only after everything has been completed? Only after the component auditor has completed all procedures? I would say no. Rather, a little earlier than the completion of the procedures, so that if there are issues, we are aware of that and we get time to look into those matters. We can also get involved in discussions with the entities, components management, and try and resolve those issues. So always, preferably set a date prior to the completion of the component audit and review these things. And of course, at the end of the audit, you can have your own review on all matters. But all these issues, potential issues that the component auditor may have identified, must be discussed in advance. That is a better way of managing things. Okay. I have just giving you an agenda for the meeting with the component auditor. This is just an illustrative agenda. You will discuss. Generally, you should ask the engagement partner or the manager to give an overview of their firm, their competence, their experience, etc. They should also present about the business operations of the entity, the key management people, the key risk areas, the control environment, independence of the audit team, regulatory environment. These are matters which I already discussed. I don't want to take your time on this. It is again the timetable which I told you about. One point I did not mention was about significant areas of estimation and judgment. We need to discuss with the component auditor before the actual audit is started, to understand what are the significant areas of judgment and estimation, because these are two critical areas of any audit, and therefore we should understand it so that it is easy for us to focus on those areas when we finalize the audit. So that's about it. And now we come to what procedures they should perform at the finalization stage. Earlier I had told about what procedures should be performed by the principal auditor at the planning stage. And now at the finalization stage, what he has to do? He has to audit procedures performed by the competent auditor to ensure that the work of the competent auditor is adequate. This is very important. You must review the work of the competent auditor to get a comfort that he has carried out adequate work, appropriate work. And then at the planning stage, you must have already given him certain instructions on exactly how to deal with certain matters, how to deal with significant risk areas, what should be the materiality, etc. These you must ensure that they have followed up and they have complied with those specific requests that we have made at the planning stage. Then we, of course, will discuss the significant findings of the competent auditor, and competent auditor must have concluded how he should respond to those issues. So we discuss it with them. We need to agree with the competent auditor. We will discuss and agree. We will find out how it can be dealt with. Then, now in report, we have also got key audit matter if it's a listed entity. If there are listed key matters to be reported, we need to understand what is the key matter that he will be reporting in his report. And then looking at the materiality and other matters, we have to also take a call. The principal auditor also has to take a call whether he has to report those key audit matters in his consolidated audit report also. Now, how will the principal auditor conduct the review? Will he send emails and do the review? He will ask certain questions through email and do a review, or he will make a phone call or a video call, or will he visit? Ideally, the principal auditor must visit the competent auditors at least at the start of a new audit. Means if it is a new client that you are dealing with, it is always good to visit that competent auditor. Visibility will give us more idea about his competence, and it also gives us a very good understanding of, because normally when we visit the competent auditor, we will also visit the management of the entity, and those visits will give us a clear picture. It will help us to understand how reliable, how competent are those people we are going to finally deal with, and whose financial statements we will have to consolidate in the parent company's financial statements. Now, I already told you that he has to review the working of the competent auditor, either directly or indirectly. But he can take notes, but he cannot demand the working papers of the competent auditor. This is very important. There could be fights later on. So be aware that we have no right to demand it. If he gives, we can take it, but otherwise we will have to take notes on those working papers if we wish to. Now, after you have reviewed it, you may find that you are not comfortable with certain work that they have done on certain critical areas, significant audit areas. So what can you do? Ideally, you must request the competent auditor to do some additional procedures which you think will give you comfort on that area. So there is always a right, you have always a right to request the competent auditor to do certain procedures. Now, the question is, will the competent auditor be ready to do that? You cannot push the competent auditor to do it. That is a situation, because the ISA 600 is talking about what the principal auditor should be doing. It is not talking really about what the competent auditor should be doing. Therefore, there is no standard to really push the competent auditor and make him do some extra additional procedures that you think is required. And therefore, then what can you do? You can step into and do those additional procedures. I must also add that it is very easy to say that you must step in and do those additional procedures. But in practical sense, it may not be always easy, because it is not only just the competent auditor who should agree on it. The entity or the competent management also should allow us to do that. There may be certain laws in certain countries, if it is outside of India, that will not allow a third party to come and look into their books of accounts. Therefore, these are matters. If you remember when I started on how you accept, what are the things you should look at when you accept and plan, I had told you that we must also inquire and find out if we will be allowed to do additional procedures if required. And it is always good that upfront we agree on what we can do, what additional procedures if needed. I'm not saying that we should always do the additional procedures, but if you are not comfortable with the work of the component auditor and the component auditor is not ready, or even if he has done some additional procedures, we are not comfortable with the work he has done, then it is important for us to see if we can step in and do those additional procedures. If that is was not also possible, then there is a scope limitation in the work we have done, and probably we may have to consider looking at the materiality of this and the significance of the work that we are not able to complete. We may have to decide whether we need to modify our audit report. Now, in every case, it is good that we ask the component auditor to prepare a summary of the work he has done and his conclusion on that work, on the final work he has done, which is generally called audit conclusion memo. This is again something we must ask at the beginning of the audit, at the planning stage itself, so that it is not a surprise for him at the year end for us to ask him to give us an audit conclusion memo. So early warning memos, audit conclusion memos, then his acceptance of being ready to do additional procedures if required by us, or the entity's acceptance of us stepping in and doing the additional procedures must all be agreed at the beginning of the audit, at the planning stage itself. When I say us, I mean the external auditor. I hope we are clear about this. Unfortunately, because we are not able to interact and I cannot see your faces, I hope what I'm saying is clear to you, audible to you, and you are able to follow me properly. See, now the question is, does the auditor have to, Selvan, can you please go back to the previous slide?
Yes. Yes, this one, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Now I just want to tell you that apart from doing all this, apart from this detailed review and getting information from the component auditor, we must also document. This is a requirement of the standard for all audit that we do. For the evidence that we have gathered, we must document. And here also we must adequately document the work we have done with regard to the component auditor. Can we move forward? What is the extent of the documentation that is to be made by the principal auditor? This is very critical, because ultimately, even if we have done a lot of work, unless we document that work, there is no use. Nobody will accept that you have done that work. But I think many of you, when you face the peer review, this is a very important matter that you need to be careful about. When the peer reviewer comes and looks at your audit working papers, he may not find that you have done, there is no document on some of the work that you have done. But at the same time, you can put your hand on your heart and say that, yes, sir, I have done this work. I know I have done this. My staff has done this. I have looked at it. But where is the evidence? Unless you have done the documentation properly, you will not be able to produce evidence that you have done the work appropriately. And therefore, like in every other aspect of the audit that we do, we must have proper documentation of the evaluation of the work done by the other auditor or the component auditor. So we have already compiled or understood some details of the component that we are going to audit, because I told you at the beginning of the audit, we should get some information, some critical information, key information about the component, better to document it so that we have evidence that we have understood the entity and its risks. Okay. We have to look at we have to gather details of the component auditor, and we have to also conclude on the competence of those competent auditor. What is competence of the competent auditor? It is basically the education level of the competent auditor, or what he has studied and his knowledge base. So if he is a chartered accountant of another country, we can always get comfort. Okay, he is a chartered accountant of English, of Sri Lanka or whatever. So we need to understand we need to document what is the competence of this competent auditor. What are the materiality thresholds that we agreed with the competent auditor? You know that a competent auditor cannot keep a very high materiality, which is higher than the materiality that we have fixed for the principal, for the parent company. So therefore, we would have at the planning stage of the audit, we would have agreed a materiality threshold, and we need to document this is exactly the materiality threshold that we have agreed with the parent company, with the competent auditor, and we need to also give some basic explanation why we consider that materiality threshold to be appropriate and adequate. Now, I told you earlier that you have the right, the parent auditor has the right to scope out certain components if they are materially small, not important when taken and when looking at the overall size of the parent entity. But it is important that we must document what are the entities that we have scoped out and why we believe they are not material and they can be scoped out. This is also very important. Like we should put into a file the instructions that we should. I told you we need to send instructions to the other auditor or the competent auditor. It is always good to keep those instructions in our files as a document. And we have always identified some significant audit areas, and we would have communicated it to them at the planning stage. So document that, so that at any stage you can always stand up and say, yes, I looked at the significant audit areas and I have already communicated this to the competent auditor. And if you have only told him about some special audit procedures that he has to perform, then those have to be documented. Then if there are certain key audit matters, then that must be documented. What is the key audit matter that we discussed and how the entity has looked at it, all those information we must document. Then our notes on the extent of review that we have carried out. And if we received early warning memos, we need to document them and make comments on how we dealt with those early warning memos, the matters in those early warning memos. Finally, once you have done all this work, we have to conclude on the competent auditor's findings and their work. And we need to also look at whether there is any requirement for any modification of our audit report, the audit report of the consolidated parent company. And if we think there is some modification required because of certain matters identified at the component level, we need to also document very clearly why we consider it as important. So now we come to the reporting. Does the parent auditor have the freedom on reporting? In my view, yes, he has absolute freedom on reporting. If the principal auditor concludes that he cannot use the work performed by the competent auditor, and the principal auditor himself has not been able to perform sufficient audit procedures on the financial information of the component, the principal auditor should express a qualified opinion or a disclaimer because there is a limitation on the scope of audit. This I have already mentioned. The principal auditor has to, on completion of the audit, review the work of the competent auditor and conclude whether he can rely on the work that the competent auditor has carried out. Or if he cannot rely, he can also try and ask the competent auditor to do additional procedures. And if he is still not comfortable with those additional procedures which the competent auditor has performed, he may step in and do some additional procedures. But if these three were not possible, then he has a question mark whether the matter is material enough or pervasive enough that he has to modify his report. So before you decide on modification, you must really look at the relevance of the issues vis-a-vis the consolidated financial statement. If the matter is not material, if it is not pervasive, there may be a question whether you need to modify the audit report. Even if the competent auditor has modified it, when it comes to the parent company, it may not be pervasive enough, or it may not be material enough for you to modify it. So this is a question that you need to address and take a view. Now, the standard very clearly talks about certain responsibilities of the competent auditor, of the principal auditor when he is dealing with the other auditor. See, the beauty of SA 600 is that the principal auditor will not be responsible in respect of the work entrusted to the other auditor. So this is different from what is in international standards on auditing. Under the international standards on auditing, which was revised, I think in the year 2009, the principal auditor is completely responsible for even for the work of the competent auditor. But in our standard SA 600, which is effective from the year 2002, the principal auditor is not prima facie responsible for the work of the other auditor, which is the competent auditor. But except in circumstances in which case doubt has aroused or he has suspicion about the reliability of the work performed by the auditor. But however, even when we say that he is not prima facie responsible for the work of the other auditor, the competent auditor, like we have already seen, he has to perform certain procedures. He has to oversee the work of the other auditor or the competent auditor, make sure that the competent auditor has carried out the work properly. You must have given him instructions on what exactly has to be done, and once the work has been completed, you have to review it and take a conclusion that the work has been properly done. But during this process, if you have not been able to get that comfort that the competent auditor has not carried out his work properly, if you have a suspicion about the reliability of the work performed by the competent auditor, that's the wording used in this standard. If you have a suspicion on the reliability of the work performed by the competent auditor, you may not be completely happy with the work that the competent auditor has performed, but if you think that, oh, he has done very shallow level of work, I cannot take the comfort from this work because I have to consolidate these financial statements into the financial statements of the parent on which I am going to give an opinion, and that is where I will have to very clearly mention I am not happy. Then another very important thing I told you, because you do not have prima facie the responsibility for the conduct of the audit of the component, you have been allowed to make a disclosure in the audit report about the division of responsibility, which means that when you are issuing the audit report of the parent company, you have to mention very clearly that this is the extent of responsibility that I had, that I was not, that this entity, let us say it is like this, this entity has 4 subsidiaries. The total value of the assets of the 4 subsidiaries comes to so much rupees and so much millions. We can put it in millions also. And the total assets of the entity comes to so much millions. And the audit of these entities were conducted by another auditor. And I am relying on the work of those auditors, and therefore I am not responsible for those work. I'll show you in the next slide the kind of audit report, the wordings that we use when you are issuing the audit of a consolidated financial. When we are issuing an audit report on the consolidated financial statement of an entity which has competent auditors. See, under other matters, you will say, we did not audit the financial statements of 6 subsidiaries whose financial statements reflected total assets of 540 crores and net assets of rupees so much, and net cash outflows amounting to so much at the year end. These financial statements have been audited by other auditors whose reports have been furnished to us by management And our opinion on the consolidated financial statement insofar as it relates to the amounts and disclosures included in respect of these subsidiaries and joint ventures, in the case there are joint ventures, insofar as it relates to the aforesaid subsidiaries, is based solely on the reports of the other auditors. We are saying those numbers included in the consolidated financial statements are solely based on the report of the other auditors. We are washing off our hands. Our opinion on the consolidated financial statements and our report on other legal regulatory requirements below is not modified in respect of the above matter, because when you have another matter paragraph, it is also important to say that it is not a modified opinion. This other matter does not make a modification of the report. So that is what we have to do. So now I think I have covered almost all aspects of SA 600. If you have questions, you can note it down, and at the end of this session, we can have a discussion on that. Now, just before we move to the next standard, I wish to summarize. Principal auditor is not responsible in respect of the work entrusted to the other auditor. We have already seen it, and we also say that we can report it in our audit report, that we should report. But he will not be responsible provided he exercises adequate skill and care to rely on the work of the other auditor. We have already seen what is it that we need to do. What are the instructions we should issue during the acceptance and planning level? What are the things that we need to do at the finalization stage? He must communicate what he expects from the other auditor. Yes, I told you, these must be properly communicated. I think I did not mention, there is something called audit instructions, component audit instructions, that will tell the component auditor about the materiality, the significant risks that we perceive are there in that component, and how the component auditor should address those risks, and the timetable for the audit, the early warning memos that he has to issue, the timeline for the early warning memos. All these matters must be ideally communicated to the auditor so that there is no confusion later on. You may say that I have told you to do this, and they will say, no, I did not listen to that. I did not hear that. When did you tell me about it? So these questions can come up later. I have seen these things happen. So it is always good to have proper communication. Give instructions in writing to the component auditor. He must also communicate to the component auditor what he exactly expects at the end of the audit. Must review the work performed by the other auditor. I told you he has to review it. Ideally, he should be personally present, or he can do it remotely, but he must ensure that he is able to do the work properly. Must document the summary of the review that he has conducted. I already mentioned this. Disclose in the audit report the division of responsibility. We just seen how a audit report is prepared, showing the division of responsibility. And in case of a modified opinion that is coming from the component, he must conclude whether to deal with that modification in the parent company's report also. Because I told you, it may not be perverse enough to be dealt with at the parent company's audit report. So these are the key things, if I sum up, that we must be aware of in the audit of when we use the work of another auditor. I just mentioned that you can ask questions at the end of this, at the fag end of this presentation. Now it is time to move to, let's say, 610, which is using the work of internal auditors. I hope you will give me 5 minutes, just 5 minutes break, and then we will start immediately. The time according to my watch is 5:54. Let us start at 6 sharp. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes. At 6 o'clock. So can we start?
Thank you very much, and welcome back, my colleagues. Shall we start now? We now move on to SA 610 revised, using the work of internal auditors. I think many of you are familiar, probably most of you will be familiar with this because during the audit that you conduct, you must have come across the work of internal auditors, and I believe you must have also used that work to some extent in your audits. So I'll start with using the work of internal auditor. Sylvan,
Sir, you
slide
can
is
click
not.
on center of the page and you can.
Yeah. Okay, I have to go back.
Yeah, you can put up arrow, sir. You can click up arrow.
Yeah. So let us look at what is the scope of this standard. When can it that we can use the work of internal auditor? Can we always use the work of internal auditor, or are there certain conditions for using the work of internal auditor? To what extent can we rely on the work of internal auditor? What are our responsibilities as an external auditor when we use the work of internal auditor? Can we blindly use it, or what are we supposed to do on this? And what we should document. Documentation, I told you before, is part of our audit evidence gathering, and it must be there in respect of every work that we do. So we need to also understand what exactly we should document. So I said, what is the scope of this audit? It deals with the use of internal auditors' function in external audit. You see the word function. It is the use of, not the use of internal auditor per se, it is the use of the internal audit function or the internal auditor's function in our external audit. That is the first thing. And secondly, it also deals with taking direct assistance from the internal auditor as part of in our external audit. See, very clear. One is the very function of internal audit that an entity has, how we can use it. And the second thing is we are like hiring, taking on deputation, or giving specific work to the internal auditor, which is like a direct assistance in our external audit. So these are the two matters that is dealt with in this standard. Of course, the standard also talks about the responsibilities of the external auditor if he wants to use the work of an auditor. It is not just that we can take the work, put it into our file, and say that okay, these the areas the internal auditor has already done, and therefore I am taking comfort. No, you need to also do certain procedures and then conclude whether you can rely on the work of the internal auditor. Then the standard will not apply if there is no internal audit function. Now under the Companies Act, I believe it is section 138, if I'm not mistaken, the function of an internal audit is compulsory for certain companies that achieve certain thresholds. So you may come across many entities which already have a robust internal audit function. Then there may be certain internal audit functions whose activities are not relevant to the audit. There is possibility of that. It may be that they are looking at certain operational aspects. There is an internal audit team. They may not be exactly called the internal audit team, or they may be called an internal audit team, who are looking at certain production aspects, let us say, operational activities. They may be looking at the normal wastage versus abnormal wastage. They may be looking at certain other aspects of production, how they are achieving the production target, only on specific things which is not in relation to the financial statements or audit. And therefore, if their activities are not relevant to our audit, then we cannot really call them internal auditors for the purpose of this standard. It may be also that the external auditor does not wish to use the work of internal auditor, because under 315, under section SA 315, he must have looked at the capabilities or the functioning of the internal audit internal audit department. And because under 315 you are supposed to look at the functioning of the internal audit as part of gathering information, and you think that the entity does not have a robust internal audit function, and therefore you conclude right from the beginning that no, I am not going to use the work of the internal auditors, and therefore you will not be using the internal audit. There is no compulsion. The standard or any standard does not compel the external auditor to use the work of the internal auditor. It is an option given to him that he can use it under certain circumstances only, under certain conditions only. There is no compulsion for use of it. He can always decide not to use it. And even if you are using the work of an internal auditor, you are not absolved from the responsibility of the audit. Okay, 5 areas of the internal auditor you have taken and you have accepted it. You have looked at it, you have accepted it. You believe that they have done a proper work and you can rely on that. And yet, if something has gone wrong later on, then you cannot say, sorry, I did not do the work of these areas. It is the internal auditor who did it and I just accepted it. No. Even if you have done all procedures required of you to accept the work of the internal auditor, yet if some issues happen, you are held responsible. You cannot pass the buck to the internal auditor. That is very important to remember. Now, I told you about our internal audit function. So what is an internal audit function? It is, of course, a management function. We all agree on that. It is a continuous assurance and consulting activity which is designed to evaluate the effectiveness of the entity's risk management. So basically, an internal audit function is looking at, they would have already identified the key risks of the organization by department, and they must have also looked at what type of controls the entity has, and then they will look at whether these controls are operating effectively. They will also look at the governance procedures in the organization. So governance is also a matter that is coming under the scope of the internal audit. So the internal auditor basically looks at, he identifies the risks, identifies and concludes whether the controls that are placed by the company to mitigate those risks are appropriate and adequate, whether the controls are operating effectively all throughout the year. So this is exactly what an internal auditor is expected to do with regard to the work that he is doing. Then, so they will, like I told you, they will evaluate the controls put in place. They will basically the internal auditor that we are talking about will focus on the financial information of the organization. I told you in the previous slide that if the auditor is not, if the work of the internal audit is not relevant to the audit, that if he is not focusing on the financial information and its reporting, then for us it is not an internal audit under the standard, which is very important. The internal auditor reviews compliance with laws and regulations. Yes, this is a very important area of the work of internal auditor. He will review and ensure that the entity complies with the laws and regulations. If they do not comply with the laws and regulations, it has an impact on the financial statements. It could have an impact on the financial statements, and therefore the internal auditor must be expected to have look at the compliance with laws and regulations. Then, like I told you, of late, the internal audit function is also looking at the governance function within that organization. So basically, they look at the principle, ethical, whether the entity has applied ethical principles, whether there have been breaches on the ethical principles, whether those breaches have been identified, whether corrective action has been taken on those breaches. All these factors also are looked into by the internal auditor. So I told you it's a management function. It focuses on financial statement information. It looks at the entity's risk management, identification of risk, controls that has been implemented, of effective operation of the controls, and also it focuses on laws and compliance with laws and regulations and governance matter principles of the entity. So we are clear about what the internal audit function is. We are talking about internal audit function. Be very clear about that word function. So who can be considered as an internal auditor? Like I told you, there are a couple of engineers looking at the production process, whether there have been abnormal wastages, the reasons for those wastages, or there are people looking at the production process, whether adequate quantity of production is achieved, what are the deviations, the reasons for deviations. Are they considered as internal auditor for this purpose? No, they are not considered internal auditor. So who are the internal auditors? Like it said in the previous slide, people who are focused on the financial information and reporting. So they are the internal auditors. Is that enough under the standard to consider somebody as an internal auditor? No. The internal auditor function must be performed objectively by competent persons, by applying systematic and disciplined approach. These are very critical words. That is why I have marked them in red. The internal audit function to be considered under this standard or to be used under this standard must have been performed objectively. I'll come to what is objectivity. By competent people. Who is a competent person? Who has enough knowledge and education on internal audit or matters around the internal audit. So competent person. By applying systematic and disciplined approach. What will be the systematic and disciplined approach? Basically, it talks about the organization, how the policies of the organization are focused on the internal audit. What are the rules of internal audit? What are the powers of the internal auditor? How is this work reviewed? How is action taken on his work? These are all very important. If we have an internal audit function and the internal auditor keeps on giving reports to the management, it does not go to the board of directors, it does not go to those in charge of governance, it rather goes to the CFO. He looks at it and keeps it in the file. So can it be called an internal audit for the purpose of ISA, this ISA 610? No, not at all. So we need to see if there is objectivity in the work that they are doing. What is objectivity? Objectivity means people or professionals performing tasks without any bias or any conflict of interest or undue influence. Assuming we have an entity, a private company, which has got a managing director, and his younger brother is a chartered accountant practicing in the same city, and he is appointing that younger brother's firm as the internal audit of that firm, of that entity. Do you think that appointment or the function of the internal auditor meets objectivity? I would say definitely not, because there is a big question mark whether that internal auditor will be able to perform his tasks without bias. There is definitely a conflict of interest because of the relationship between the managing director and the internal auditor. There is every chance that an undue influence will be exerted on the younger brother. Mind you, he is also a younger brother, on the work of the internal auditor, and therefore we cannot really take that internal auditor and his work for the purpose of this standard. So who can be an internal auditor? It can be an individual or a firm of individuals. So there is no compulsion that it has been individual. So when we look at and when we before we decide to use the work of an internal auditor, we must determine the nature and scope of the internal auditor's activities. What are the areas that he is covering? What type of work is he giving? Is the scope of internal audit covering the work of financial reporting? Is that scope of work that he is covering good enough for me to rely on the work that he is performing? So that is very important for us to understand this. Then it is important for us to look at the stature and status of the internal auditor. This is very, very important. I have seen in entities the internal audit function, which is being handled by somebody at the manager level. Again, he is not given any respect. His reports are not taken seriously, and he rarely gets any opportunity at all, I would say, to meet the managing partner or the chairman and tell them about what he has done, what his observations were. So in that case, if his stature and status is very low, then we cannot say that we cannot rely on the work that he is performing. Very clear. Then this is the next one is very important. Existence of policies and procedures that support the objectivity of the internal audit. This is the most important thing. So you must have proper policies and procedures which will very clearly give us the comfort that the internal audit function is not biased. So it will say who can be appointed as an internal auditor. It will also say who are not allowed to function as an internal auditor, who are not allowed to be in the internal audit team. So there will be very clear policy and there will be very clear procedure on what they are expected to do, how important is the internal audit function, what is the periodicity of the internal audit procedures that they have to carry out, and whether what are identified as conflict of interest, what are identified as undue influence, how the entity ensures that it is insulated from these biases or conflicts of interest or undue influence. If they are all properly documented as policies, then we can say the entity has enough objectivity or the internal audit function has enough objectivity. So it is very important for us to look into these matters. Then the other question, another matter which I told you, which I have seen, is the competence of the internal auditor. What is the competence of the internal auditor? Basically, when you talk about competence, it is the education level of the internal auditor. He has to have proper and preferably professional education on the internal audit. Then a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality check, which I told you, procedures must be properly written down. What are the procedures to be performed as part of the audit? There must be audit programs. All these will indicate that the audit is being performed systematically and professionally. So this we need to see if these are properly followed. Then we need to look at who they report to and their access to the to those charged with governance. So it is very important. And like I told you, I already mentioned that if they are not able to report to the chairman or those charged with governance, I think their report will not be taken seriously. If they are reporting only to the CFO or the CEO or CEO, it will not help because CEO is a management person, CFO is a management person. So it is important that they have access to those charged with governance. If that is not there, I don't think we can rely on the work of the internal auditor. The degree of importance given to the reports and the process of follow-up actions is also very important. If reports, like I told you earlier, are just filed up, then there is no use. Constraints, we must also look whether there are constraints placed on the work of the internal auditor. So these are important matters that we need to look into before we finally consider that the function of the internal audit is something that is accepted under this standard. So we need to inquire and understand and get a clear understanding of what is happening, what is the scope of the work, whether they are independent, whether there is objectivity, whether there are constraints placed on the function, whether there is a proper follow-up on the reports issued by the internal auditor. All these matters we must properly understand and document before we start using the work of the internal auditor. When can internal audit work be used? Well, we already mentioned if it supports objectivity, then we can use it. If there is sufficient competence, again, it's like a revision, sufficient competence, then we can, if there is a systematic and disciplined approach, yes, likely to be relevant. If that work is very relevant, should be relevant to the audit, which I already told you. If it is something on the production part, then it is not relevant. It is only on talking about the production or whatever, which is not linked to the financial statements, then it is not relevant for the purpose of the external auditor to use that function of the internal auditor. Then by evaluating, we must have decided the adequacy of the work of the internal auditor for the purpose of our audit. I am repeating, the external auditor is not absolved from the responsibilities of the audit and should not refer in his audit report the work of the internal auditor that he has relied on. Can an external auditor use the entire work performed by the internal auditor? This is very important. Can he goes into the entity, he spends 1 week understanding the work of the internal auditor, he reviews their files, he understands that they have a robust function, and then therefore, can he really rely on the work of that internal auditor for all the areas of the audit, and simply based on the work of the internal auditor, can he say, yes, I am ready to sign off? Definitely not. Yes, you have been allowed by the standard to use the work of an internal auditor, but you must, on your own basis, on your own judgment, decide what is the extent of work that I can rely on. And before that, you must always understand the nature and extent of the work performed by the internal auditor, and then decide on to what extent of the nature and extent of work that you can rely on. If he's covering all areas, can you really rely on all the areas? I will not say no. So basically, when you look at and take a call on how much work you can rely on, you must always make sure that you take a low level of work from the internal auditor, not the high level of work, not a high level of work. Maybe 20% or 25% of the work you may of the or external audit work, you may rely on the internal auditor. The work, or you may rely on the work of the internal auditor. Otherwise, you should not rely on the entire work of the internal auditor. Now, one more thing I need to also, there are certain things that you should not rely on the work or the internal auditor. The areas where there is a significant judgment involved, you should not. Areas where the risk of material misstatement is assessed as high, can you rely on the internal auditor? I will not rely on it. Areas where the robustness of the internal function is considered low, you have already assessed it. You are saying, okay, it is okay, but you are not comfortable with the real robustness. You have not seen a real robustness in the work, and it is considered to be medium to low. Then you rather only use them or use their work only in areas which are not significant in the audit, low risk areas. And if you are also concerned about the competence, you should not rather use them, or you should use them only at a very low risk area. So in the aggregate, the external auditor must ensure that he has got enough involvement in the audit. He cannot just rely completely on the internal auditor and say, yes, I have relied on the internal auditor and I am comfortable with it. And finally, it is very important that if he is going to rely on the work of internal auditor, he must communicate that to those who are in charge of governance, and he must also inform the internal auditor, look, gentlemen, we have looked at your work, we have looked at your working papers, we think we can take some comfort on the work you have done, and so and so areas of work that you have done, we are going to rely on. This must be informed, most probably, hopefully in writing also. So what are the, like I told you, in the scope of the standard, I told you there are two things. One is the scope talks about how you take the function of internal auditor, how we use direct assistance of the internal auditor, and the third one in the scope was what are the responsibilities of the external auditor when using the internal auditor. He has to discuss and agree on the planned use of the internal audit function. Like I told you, he has to inform those with charge with governance, and he has to inform the internal audit function about what he plans to do, and he has to communicate ideally in writing. He must read the audit reports and understand the extent of audit procedures performed and the related findings. He must read the report. He must also look into the audit working papers of the internal audit department and conclude whether enough work has been done. He must evaluate the work performed by the internal auditor, carrying out audit procedures on the work performed by the internal auditor. He must assess if the internal audit work has been properly planned, sufficient appropriate audit evidence was obtained, and the conclusions reached are appropriate. So he cannot just take the work, he has to apply his own audit procedures to understand if sufficient audit work has been carried out and the act and the work has been appropriately performed, supervised and reviewed and documented. So he must also ensure that there are different levels of officers in the internal audit department, so that one person work is being reviewed and supervised by another person, and the final conclusions are properly evaluated and accepted. The evaluation by the external auditor should be carried out by bearing in mind the amount of judgment involved. So where the judgment involved is high, I would say the external auditor should not rely on the work. Even if he decides to rely on the work, he must expect more robustness on the part of the internal audit when they did that work. He must also look at the risk assessed in each area, and depending on the level of risk, he must be expecting the level of robustness to go up when the risk has been assessed as high. And he must always look at the objectivity of the internal auditors and their level of competence. So these are the matters, these are the responsibilities of the external auditor before or if he decides to use the work of the internal auditor, of the functions of the internal auditor, I would say. Now, I told you at the beginning that there are two areas that the standard is talking about when we use the work of the internal auditor. One is you use the internal auditor function. This is what we have talked so far are the use of the internal auditor's functions, that he is doing the internal audit. We are looking at the work of the internal auditor and deciding on using some part of the work. So what are the types of work that you and I may depend on the functions of the internal auditor? I would say in any case, particularly depending on the size of the entity and the complexities of the entity's operations, I would rather go for low risk areas where complexities are low and depend on and use, for example, bank reconciliation work that the internal auditor has performed, or the what is it called, documentation, or the documentation of payments made by the client, the expenses met by the client, how recording of expenses. These are some of the areas that I will look at, and I will not look at the adequacy of the provision work that they have done, or the valuation work he may have done. Those are not areas because they need a lot of estimation and judgment, and definitely the work, even if they have done very good work, I would rather not do it. I would rather myself do that work. So we must take a call on what level of work we will depend on, the work, what level of work that the internal auditor has performed that we will depend on. This is very important. We have to, these decisions are based on our understanding of the nature, extent and timing of the work that they are doing, the objectivity, the competence and the independence, the bias, unbiased functions of the internal auditor, whether there is a good procedure, whether there is a proper supervision of their work, whether how they report, who looks at their report, who ensures that the action is taken on the report. All these are matters that we should consider before we decide on the extent of reliance that we place on the work of internal audit. Now we are coming to what I call the use of when we can take direct assistance of the internal auditor. What is a direct assistance of the internal auditor? One example that I can give is, like, we all send balance confirmations to the clients at the year end. This is a laborious process. This is some work perhaps we can give to the internal auditor, or we can take the assistance of the internal auditor to perform. We will give them, we will identify, but here we have got a lot of work to do before we give it to them. We have to identify, we have to take a policy, we have to have a policy on how we select the clients from whom we have to get the confirmation. And then we have to give this responsibility to the internal audit department. We have to identify who will give us the support, whether they are appropriate, whether their knowledge, experience is appropriate to do this work, and then we will get the work done by them. And always, all throughout the time they are doing the work, we have to ensure that we properly direct and supervise their work. So again, I tell you, where the degree of judgment is high, we should not give that work. We will not take the direct assistance of the internal auditor to do that work. Where the risk of the assessed risk of material misstatement is high, we should not ask the internal auditor to assist us in doing certain work where the risk of material misstatement is very high. And like I told you, if you have already identified the objectivity level of the internal audit department is not as much as we wished, we will not really give them much work on direct assistance. We will not ask them to give direct assistance in certain functions which we are supposed to do as external auditor. See, the standard is specifically saying don't get the following work done by the internal auditor, or don't get the direct assistance of the internal auditor for the following procedures that require significant judgments. I already mentioned it, where the risk of material misstatement is high. Work which when the internal auditors have been involved and or will report such work to the management. If the internal auditor has already done for the bank's purpose certain work, or for the client's purpose certain work, we should not use them again to help us in doing the same work, because then it becomes familiarity issue. The decisions that the external auditor will make regarding the internal audit function. If we are looking at the functions of certain functions of the internal auditor, or we have already looked at certain functions and taking certain decisions on their work, then we should not ask them to do that work again for us. Once it is concluded that a direct assistance can be sought, the external auditor shall communicate those charged with governance on the plan, scope, and timing of the assistance sought. Again, like in the other case where we use the function of internal audit, if we are going to use the direct assistance of the internal auditor, we must let those charged with governance know it, and of course we will also inform the internal audit department of the type of assistance that we will need. Now, we have already seen what are the responsibilities of internal auditor, responsibility of the external auditor if he is relying on the work of the functions, internal auditor functions. Similarly, there are certain responsibilities on the external auditor if he wants to rely on the work, if he wants to use the internal audit team directly for certain audit functions. So he must have a written agreement with the entity and the internal audit department. The external he should direct, this I mentioned you already, he should direct, supervise, and review the work performed by the internal audit team whom he has taken, from whom he has taken the assistance. He should check the underlying evidence of work that they have done. So he has to direct and supervise and review the work, and then finally when the work is completed, he must again verify the work that they have done and then conclude whether the work is enough. So all through the performance of the work, the external auditor shall direct, supervise, and review the work to ensure that the work is performed appropriately for the purpose of the external auditor. So very simple. If you are using the direct assistance, again there are limitations. You must understand whether you must look at the objectivity, the competence, and the independence of these people whom you are using. That you must ensure that you have communicated the work properly, communicated the work to be done properly. You must have informed those charged with governance that you are going to use it. Then you must, all throughout the exercise of the work, all through the work that they are doing, direct work that they are assisting, you must ensure that you direct, supervise, and review the work performed properly. I hope I am very clear to you. The problem is that I am not able to catch your eyes and see whether you are following it properly or whether I need to have explained it better. Unfortunately, I hope soon we will have the classroom kind of sessions, and then it will be easier for all of us. So what, again, documentation, I told you, in every work that we do, we have to document. So what is the documentation required in this case? We have to document the evaluation of the internal auditor as regards his organization status, the relevant policies and procedures that ensure objectivity. We already mentioned about it, level of competence, and whether the function applies systematic and disciplined approach. The same as in the case of in the other case, we have to evaluate. We have to understand the nature and extent of work performed by the internal auditor and the basis of decision to entrust that work. So we have to decide, okay, A, B, C, D are the work we are going to make them do, and we have to document it also properly and say why we think this is a work that we can entrust them. Then we have to say how we supervise the work, how we directed the work, and why you think the adequacy of the work that they have done, that the work that they have done is adequate for the purpose for which we have used them. This is very important. We need to document it so that there is an evidence that what we did, how we supervised, and how we concluded that we can rely on that work which we on which we got the assistance of the internal auditor or direct assistance of the internal auditor. The findings from the internal auditor's direct work and how we dealt with must be also documented very clearly. And written agreement when the entity as well as copies of correspondence which we had with the internal auditor must be documented. Working paper is prepared by the internal auditor in regard to supervision, direction should also be documented. So we must have proper and rigorous documentation with regard to why we selected, what is the nature of work we interested, why we think that nature of work could be done by them, what is the objectivity, what are the policies that promote the objectivity, what is the competence level, what is the approach, what is the system, what is the systematic and disciplined approach of the internal audit department. All these things must be documented. And finally, we must also say how we reviewed the work and what conclusions we have made on that. Clear? So to sum up on the total standard of 610, two types of reliance is possible. One is on the function, which I already mentioned a couple of times, on the function of the internal auditors, and then using the direct assistance of the internal auditors. So these are very clear now. The external auditor remains solely responsible for the audit. Like I told you before, I cannot say A, B, C areas were done by, I relied on the work of the internal auditor for A, B, and C areas, and therefore I am not responsible. No, you are totally responsible. You have to, it is your call whether to rely on the work of the internal auditor and limit the work or procedures that you have done in those area. See, one thing I want to again mention here is that even when you rely on the work of internal auditors in certain areas, it is important that you look at their work, you look at the audit programs, and you look at the substance of the work they have done, and then take a call whether these are reliable. So these are things which you have to do. Even if you are relying on it, you need to review the work and then take that final call whether you rely on that. I told you before, we have to document on the organizational status, the objectivity of the internal auditors, the competence, the supervision of the work process, etc., which I told you in every case we need to document it. You must have written agreements with the entity and the internal auditors. We must document the results of the evaluation of the internal audit function, comfort we have obtained, procedures we have performed on the work of the internal auditor. Now I told you, we need to take samples of work they have done. We need to review their files. We need to look at we need to do a reperformance of some of the work that they have done before you take a full comfort on the work they have done. And these, whatever we have done to get a reliance or to get a comfort on the work of the internal auditor, those things must be documented so that it is an evidence for us to say that we have put proper due diligence on the work of the internal auditor before we accepted them or used them as part of the external audit function. We should not, again, I repeat, we should not refer to the work of internal auditor in our audit report. We means the external auditor should not refer to the work of the internal auditor in his audit report. So basically, these are the things that I hope I have adequately explained the matters that an external auditor should be aware of when he is planning to use the work of internal auditor. Again, very simple. Basically, we need to look at the objectivity, we need to look at the competence, we need to see whether they have got competent people, to look at whether there is a proper organization where there are people to look at the work, to supervise the work, and to review the work, and to make conclusions on the work that they have performed, and whether there are the work performed by the internal auditors are taken seriously by the management, whether they have access to those charged with governance. If all these things are there, these are indications that they have a fairly robust internal audit function, and therefore it gives us the comfort to rely on the work of those internal auditors. That's about internal auditors using the work of the internal auditors. Like I told you, these three standards, 600, 610, and 620, are basically standards that talks about how to use the work of other auditors other than the external auditor. So we have already covered two standards, and we are coming to the third standard. Okay, when we are coming to the third standard, this is again a standard which tells us about using the work of an auditor's expert. Using the work of an auditor's expert. So are you ready to get into the third standard? I am not too sure about where we are on the time. I think we are good on the time. Okay, now
Hello.
yes, yeah, I am fine. I just muted for a minute. I just wanted
Okay,
to have
sir.
a cup of water. That's all.
No problem. No problem.
I am back. I hope my colleagues are also ready. I hope you are not tired. Let us try to finish the third standard also now. Now, using the work of an auditor's expert. How often do you use the work of an auditor's expert? I believe now that the accounting standard has become very complicated, our reliance on the use of an expert has also increased. I hope you agree with me. For example, the accounting standard on financial instruments, the standard provisions on the standard on making impairment provisions. Then we have got valuation of financial instruments, particularly complicated derivative instruments. These are some of the areas. Then even the valuation of real estate, all these finally force us as an external auditor to rely on, to seek, I will not say rely on, to seek the help of the expert on that subject. So this is also important. It is important that we understand what exactly is who exactly is the expert, what exactly is the type of reliance that we can place on the expert, and what are the things that we should be careful about when we place reliance on the expert, and finally how we document the work of the expert. So what is the scope of the standard? Who is an auditor's expert? When can an auditor use the work of an expert? What is the extent of reliance on the work of expert? What are the responsibilities of the external auditor when using the work of expert? You see in all the three standards, one important area that is being mentioned and discussed is what are the responsibilities of the external auditor when using the work of another auditor in the case of group audit, or the component auditor, or in the case of internal auditor, now in the case of expert. So we will now go one by one. So first question is, what is the scope of this standard? So it deals with the auditor's responsibility when he uses the expert's work. This is next sentence. The next words are very important. In a matter other than accounting or auditing. See, this deals with the auditor's responsibility when he uses an expert in an area other than accounting or auditing to assist him in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. See, two important aspects I want to highlight here are we have to use an expert in an area other than accounting or auditing. Why is it that the standard allows us to use, the standard allows us to use an expert only in an area other than accounting or auditing? Why is it? I hope you have an answer. It is because we as chartered accountants are considered as experts in the area of auditing and accounting, and therefore we are not supposed to go to an expert on this matter. However, there are certain areas, there are certain matters where we need the help of a specialized specialist in certain accounting matters, in understanding certain accounting matters. In those cases do not come under this standard because those are accounting or auditing matters. Therefore, will not be under the scope of this standard. We have SA 220, which deals with how we take the help of an expert on accounting and auditing matters. So what is important, that what should get into your head is that we are allowed to use an expert only in an area which is not an accounting area or an auditing area. Very, very important. Suppose, this is very important. Suppose the entity has already used the work of an expert. Can we use the same expert for our purpose? The answer is yes, we can still use the same expert for our purpose. But what is important is that you have to then go to SA 500, which gives us some guidance and directions on what we should do when we use the work of an expert. So that when we use the management's own expert for the purpose of our external audit, when we look at what the work he has done, and if we decide to rely on that, then certain matters, certain directions have been given by SA 500, which we have to follow before we use it. So now, despite the fact that we have approached an expert to do some work for us, to gather some evidence on certain areas, that work will not absolve the external auditor from his responsibility on that area. So like in the case of SS 610 where we use the internal auditor, and in this case also using the expert will not absolve us from our responsibility as an external auditor. However, we can still use the work of an external auditor, provided we are satisfied that we have done all those procedures which the standard required to us to perform before we rely on the work of expert. So we cannot totally rely on the work of an expert. We have to look at certain procedures and take a comfort. And even when we have done everything and done the procedures, and then we can put our hand on our chest and say, I'm very comfortable with this expert, his findings, but still we cannot say, if something goes wrong later on, we cannot say, I did everything that the standard ISA 620 told me to do, so I am not responsible. No, you cannot say that. You are still responsible for that. Okay. So now the question, I'm talking about auditor's expert. So I need to explain to you what is an auditor, who is an auditor's expert. Many of you may know it, but we need to be very clear about who is an auditor's expert, because there can be some confusion. As we move forward, I'll explain to you. So auditor's expert can be an individual or an organization. There's no problem about it. Who possess an expertise in a field other than accounting or auditing. In the previous slides, we have seen that an expert is for the purpose of this standard, only for the purpose of this standard. An expert is someone who does not possess expertise in accounting and auditing, or who possesses expertise in a field other than accounting or auditing. So if you are taking the help of an engineer to evaluate something, he is an expert in that particular evaluation. So he must have some qualifications. He must have some accreditation to certain professional bodies. He usually will have accreditation to certain professional bodies, and we can use it. If you are using an actuary to look at the gratuity evaluation, then we can say we can look at the actuary, his education, his membership in actuarial regulatory bodies, and then we can say yes, he is an expert in a field other than accounting or auditing. Okay. Then why? And the second important thing is to be identified as an expert under this standard. We must also ensure that the external auditor is going to use his work to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So two things to decide on an auditor's expert. He must be an expert in a field other than in accounting and auditing. That is very important. He must be an expert. So I will explain to you what is an expert, who is an expert. And the auditor wants to use his work to obtain sufficient. Auditor believes that his work can give him sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. So very important. Here it is audit evidence that he is giving. Okay. So he can, now there is another issue. Who can he be? He can be someone employed within the audit firm or its network firm or an external expert. So there are a couple of options for the firm or the auditor. He may have an expert within his firm whom he can use. He may use an expert in his network firm. He may be a large firm, so he has got network firm, so we can use him. And he can always use an external expert also. So these are the options that is given to him. Now, a few examples. Using a valuation report to value complex financial instruments such as derivatives. I told you at the beginning, now things have become very complicated that you need experts on valuation of complex derivative financial instruments. So you may use a valuation expert, and that valuation expert may be somebody in your firm. Your function is audit and assurance. Suppose your firm has got specialists, let us say financial management specialists or who are corporate finance specialists, who have the skills and knowledge to do valuation of complicated financial instruments. You may use them. They will be your expert. Then you may use actuarials. Actuaries may be for external parties, external actuaries who are practicing actuarial science. You may use them. So that is an external expert that you are using. So there are several. You may also use an expert to understand certain complex business operations. Let me see. I'll tell you one example. You are being given the audit of, you have been appointed as an auditor of a pharmaceutical company. The pharmaceutical company it's a very large pharmaceutical company. It has got a very large R&D also, research and development department also, function also. As you all know, a pharmaceutical company invests a lot of money on research and development of new products. Then there is a question on whether they can be capitalized, whether they have to be charged. You as an auditor may not always be able to understand it because the sphere of that research makes it very complicated for we as auditors with our knowledge of accounting and auditing to understand it. Therefore, we may help you seek the help of an expert. So then it becomes using the expertise of somebody to understand the business itself, to understand the complications of the business. So it is not just in valuation that we use, it is even in understanding the business. Sometimes we may use them to understand the risk in that business. So there are several areas as part of our audit, we may be required to use an expert, and especially as things get complicated business processes and complicated accounting requirements, the use of expert has become more and more prevalent in our audit sphere. Okay. So when we are going to use the work of an internal or of an expert, whether he's an internal expert or an external expert, internal expert means an expert within the firm or an external expert, we must agree the scope of work with him. We must be very clear about what work we expect of him, what reliance we are going to make of his work, how we are going to use it as an evidence for part of that. This we have to very clearly explain, and we have to document and agree in writing with the expert. And we must, on completion of the work, evaluate the adequacy of their work. Then the question comes up, it is already a complicated work that we have entrusted to him. How do I evaluate the adequacy of the work? Definitely. Our experience as an auditor gives us, even if we are not very complicated about the formula they use or other matters that they use, we are able to prima facie make an understanding of what they are telling us. If you do not understand it, we need to ask them clearly about it. We need to get more clarifications and gain an understanding of the work that they have done, and then take a call whether that work which they have done is adequate or not. And again, they will give us a report or they will give us a big presentation. We need to, based on that report or the presentation that they give, we have to assess the implications of their findings and take a call on using it as an evidence. Okay, so what is important? We are using an expert who is use an expert other than in the field of auditing and accounting. We have to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence by using the work of that expert. He can be an auditor, he can be an internal expert in the firm, or he can be an external expert in the firm. We have to be very clear about what is his role, what is the scope of his work, and then we have to also evaluate the work he has done and take a call whether we can use that work. Okay, now about the auditor's work. How to distinguish expertise in an accounting or auditing and expertise in a field other than accounting or auditing. You know that it is fundamental that it is very clearly explained in the standard that the expert is only somebody who is an expert in a field other than in accounting or auditing. So sometimes it becomes very complicated for us to understand whether he is an expert in a field other than in accounting or auditing. Let us talk about an actuary. It is more or less easy for us to say that he is not somebody who is an expert in accounting or auditing. But what about an expert that we use for valuation of derivatives? There is a question mark there. Maybe he is also a chartered accountant, but he is now functioning as a corporate financial advisor or looking into financial products. He has expertise to value financial products, complicated financial derivative products. And therefore, then the question is, he's an accountant. Prima facie, he's an accountant. So can we consider him as an expert in field other than in accounting or auditing when his work is in valuation? I would say yes, but we have to very clearly document it. So if he's, but there is also another important thing. If he is being placed as part of the audit team itself, because let us say there are a lot of valuations of financial products to be performed, and you think that it is always good to have expert in financial products, financial instruments and financial instrument products to be in the audit team, then he cannot be called an expert for the purpose of this, because he is part of the audit team. We are not seeking the expertise of that person outside of the audit team. So that is also very important to understand. For example, now I'll give you one example. It is more easier for you to understand. We are doing the audit. We have in the audit team an IT expert, IT auditor in our team. He is assisting us in the audit because there are a lot of ERP transactions, ERP operations in that entity. So we are using him as an IT auditor. Can we call him as an expert? Yes, he has expertise in IT, but he has become part of our audit team, and therefore you cannot call him an IT expert for the purpose of this standard. But at the same time, there are other cases. I will give you when you need to value a real estate, complicated real estate, then you use somebody externally, then he is an expert for you. So it will always be a little complicated. You need to use your judgment and make an assessment. But the best way to make the judgment and assessment is look at the qualification, professional membership of the expert, his skill sets, etc., and decide whether he is an expert or not an expert. I hope I have clearly explained this. Maybe if you have questions, you can ask me later. I'm going to give you a few examples. The auditor includes a manager from the tax practice of the firm, whose responsibility is to recompute the deferred income tax in the financial statement. Is he an expert under 620? I would say because he is part of the audit team, you are not going to call him an expert under 620. The audit team comes across another one. The audit team comes across certain complexities in the treatment of deferred tax by the entity. Certain complexities in the treatment of deferred tax by the entity. which are in the nature of interpretation of the income tax laws. And the audit partner requests the partner of the firm who is in charge of tax partner. Okay, you request the tax partner of the firm to study it and give his opinion. So here it is not just verifying the computation, deferred income tax computation, but here is a question of law, and the external auditor is not an expert in looking at the tax matters, especially interpreting the law. Therefore, he is asking the tax partner to look into it and give him his opinion based on the interpretation of the law. So here you are using the expert outside. He is from the firm itself, but he is not part of the auditing, and you are using his expertise to interpret the law, and therefore it is a real use of a real expert, and it will come under 620. See, another issue is when you do the audit, we understand that the client has a major litigation. Okay, the client has an internal legal team. They give us certain explanations, but when we look at all the relevant documents, we find that there are a lot of complications. We are not able to really put our fingers in and say, oh, okay, you have got a liability, you do not have a liability, or you are likely to have a liability or not. So what you do, you will now you will give everything to a legal expert, preferably an independent legal expert, to get his expertise on his opinion on this matter. And do you think he is an expert under the standard 620? I will say yes, he is an expert under the standard 620. So these are matters, some indications of how you will decide on who is an expert under standard 620. Now, this is again very simple. Which are the areas where assistance of an expert can be used? Like I told you, generally we talk about valuations and computations, but it is not just valuations or certain computations that we use them, not for just actuarial liability, employee liability computations by an actuary, but there are also certain other areas where we can really use them. I touched upon it, but I will just make it more specific. To obtain understanding of the entity and its operations, I told you a complex process with regard to pharmacy or any industry where the processes are very complex. You need to understand the complexes and the relevant risk associated with those complex operations. It is always good to consult an expert. This consultation will also help you to clearly understand the risk of material misstatement. This discussion also will help you what type of audit procedures you should perform to get a comfort, to get the proper audit evidence, because there are a lot of complications. So when you discuss with the expert, you will be able to properly analyze the processes, and it will help you to decide, oh, these are the risks, these are the areas which I need to find a control, and therefore it will be easy for you to come out with or develop audit procedures to mitigate the risk and also to gather audit evidence. But is it important that he should always use an expert in an audit, in every audit, or in even audits which seem to be a little complicated? There is no compulsion on the external auditor to use an expert. It is his call, it is his decision, it is his judgment to decide whether to use an external expert or an internal expert for the purpose of this audit. You know, in many cases, the external auditor would have gathered a lot of experience on the work. He would have also gone through and studied and learned a lot of information. For example, somebody who has done his DISA may be able to understand the IT operations clearly for the purpose of this audit. We may not be a big expert on this, but he may have had enough experience and knowledge on IT audit matters. And therefore, he may not need an expert in IT. He may have an internal IT specialist in his audit. So we have to take a call whether we need to we means again external auditor has to take a call whether he has to use the help of an expert for the purpose of this audit. And the expert, you know, is somebody who has expertise in a field other than in accounting and auditing. So the use of an expert in a field in accounting or auditing is not covered by this standard. I told you already. When is it that an auditor should consider using the work of an expert? Expert is needed to understand the complex operation. This is almost similar to the previous slide. I'm making it a little more clearer to you. An expert is needed to understand the complex operations of the entity. I told you a large pharmaceutical company, maybe operations may be complicated, or maybe several others operations, certain entities with very complex operations, and therefore you may need to understand it more clearly with the help of an expert. Similarly, when you understand it, you will also understand the risk of material misstatement. You will understand when you discuss, use the expert, legal expert, and discuss a litigation, you will get a clearer understanding, and you will be able to form an opinion on what type of provisions you expect the entity to make. Then it also helps you when you understand the business and the complexities of the business. It also helps you to decide on what is the nature of audit procedures that you have to perform. He must, at the end, we have to ensure that the auditor must have had a clear understanding of the capabilities of the expert, and must have that conclusion that he'll be able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence by the use of the expert. Like I told you in the previous slide, the use of an expert does not absolve him from their full responsibility for the audit. Yeah, I had touched upon this subject. Should the auditor appoint an expert if management has already used the work of an expert? If the management is using the work of an expert, he is called a management expert. When is it that the management, when can we call him as a management expert? This is also very important. There is a definition of management expert. The definition of management expert is almost the same as the definition of an auditor's expert or the external expert. The only difference is that the management expert is somebody, very important. Management expert is somebody who is assisting the management in the preparation of the financial statements or the financial information. So only if that expert, somebody who is an expert, is assisting the management in the preparation of the financial statements, we can call him as a management expert. In the case of the auditor's expert, what we said is somebody who should not have any expertise in accounting or auditing. So this is the conflicting or the real difference between an auditor's expert and a management expert. Now, if the entity is using the management expert, using a management expert, can we rely on the work of the management expert? The fact is, there is no prohibition in relying on the work of an expert or a management expert that the management has relied in the preparation of the financial statements. That is it. There is no absolute, there is no blanket prohibition in using the work of the management expert, where the management has used him in the preparation of the financial statements. But what he has to do, what the external auditor has to do, he should be comfortable with the nature, scope, and objectivity of the management expert's work. So he has to go and identify what was the nature of the work that this management expert has performed, what was his scope, and what is his work carried out objectively. What is objectively? Again, I wish to remind you that he has done the work without any bias, without any conflict of interest, and without any undue influence on it. If yes, he must ensure that that is how he has done the work. He must understand the extent to which the management can exercise control or influence on the expert. It is something like the objectivity. If the management, if you find out that the management can arm twist him and influence him and have a control over the work he has done, then it is not a reliable work that the external auditor should rely on. External auditor must inquire on the capability and competence of what is competence, like I said, on his education background, his membership, etc. Capability is skills. on the matter, how experienced he is. So if you have to be comfortable with the experience, competence of the management expert. He must look at the professional qualifications and the regulatory to which he is accredited, regulatory bodies to which he is accredited. He should evaluate the appropriateness of the management expert's work for his purpose of for gathering evidence for him. So all these are matters which the external auditor must look into before he relies on the work of the managing expert as an evidence. So work of the managing expert is not prima facie prohibited, or the external auditor is not prohibited from using the work of the management expert, but he has to take lot of comfort on the management, on the use of the management expert, whether he is doing, what is the nature of work he is doing, what is the extent of work he is doing, is he truly independent, what about his objectivity, what about his competence, what about his capability, what about his education, what are the professional bodies to which he is accredited, is the work that he is conducting, is performing appropriate for me to take comfort, to take it as an evidence. So all these are matters he should consider before he decides on relying on the work of the management expert. But one thing I want to tell you, when you are going to rely on the work of the management expert, this is not the standard on which which will guide you on that. The standard that will guide you is SA 500. If you go to SA 500 paragraph 8, there is a reference to it, and there are detailed explanations later on in the guidance of the standard. So you can, so the point, or the point you have to take here is that yes, I can use the work of the management expert, but I have to do a lot of due diligence on the work that he has done on the management expert and the work he has done. And finally, all these are governed by standard 500, which is audit evidence, and not the standard 620. Now we come to that part where we always look at the responsibilities when the external auditor is using the work of these people. We have seen it in 610, we have seen it in 600, we have seen it in 610, and now we are seeing the same thing in 620. They are more or less the same. We must evaluate whether the expert has the necessary competence. Competence, I told you, is his education, qualifications. Capabilities, I told you, is skills and experience, and objectivity, that he is unbiased. This is something we have always repeated. It is there in every case when we are relying on the work of an expert. We must obtain and document sufficient understanding of his field of expertise. Yes, we have to ask him, what is your qualification? What is the accreditation? Which professional body are you accredited to? How can I believe that you are independent? Are you related to the management? Do you have other businesses which is supported by the management? All these are questions. Are you unbiased? Can the management exert undue influence on you? All these matters we need to understand and ask him and understand and document them. We have to also ensure that the management has put in place safeguards to mitigate threats of independence. You know what is independence, what is the threat of independence, and conflict of interest. There is a self-interest. If this expert is a major shareholder in that entity for whom he is doing the work, there is a question of self-threat in the work. If he is standing up and advertising for the entity, if he has already made certain statements as an expert to the public about the products of the entity or certain processes of the entity, then we have to say that he is doing an advocacy for that entity, and therefore his independence is called into question. Similarly, with other familiarity and intimidation, if he's been regularly doing this work for so many years, and if there is a special power that he has, maybe he is related to the management, and that he can intimidate other people and come out with certain conclusions, then we say he is not independent, truly independent, and therefore it will be difficult for us to rely on the work of that expert. Then we have to also look at what is the nature of the work, and is his work appropriate or adequate for the purpose of me gathering it, considering it as an evidence. So you have to look at the adequacy and appropriateness of the work that he has performed, what is the nature of the work he has performed, what is the timing, and what is the extent of the work he has performed, and is it enough for me to gather evidence? Can I use it as an evidence? Then another very important thing, though it is coming at the end of this session, this is very important. In most cases, when the expert is looking at certain things, there will be a lot of source data that he will be using. For example, an actuary will have to get the actual age of the people, the retirement age of the people, of the employees. There are a lot of other medical information of the employees that is available to the people. All these matters have to be considered or used by the audit, by the actuary. A lot of critical data that the actuary will take from the entity and use for the purpose for his work as an expert. So we have to ensure that the actuary is using appropriate data, accurate data, and complete data. We have to look at the appropriateness of the data, the accuracy of the data, and the completeness of the data. We have to also ensure that this actuary has been consistent in the work he has performed. It is not only with the actually with every expert. If they have been doing the same similar kind of work in the past, we have to look at whether they are consistent in the way they approach this whole matter. If actually is making changes in his approach every year, then we have to question why he has done it. There must be an adequate reason for changing the approach. So these are matters we have to look at. And so again, keep in mind, it is our responsibility, primary responsibility, to look at what source data they have used, the expert has used, where is it coming from, is it the right source, right data that is going to them, is it appropriate data that is going to them, is the data accurate, is the data complete. So this is something that we must look at. Though I have mentioned it almost at the fag end of this, you must give it the most appropriate importance when we do the audit, when we start deciding whether you can use the expert. Then we have to continuously monitor the work of the expert, and we have to establish the relevance of the work for our purpose, and you have to look at and discuss what are the significant assumptions that you have used in this work, and we need to take comfort on those assumptions, that they are reasonable, they are appropriate, because these assumptions can completely change the results of the expert's work. So we need to look at the assumptions. Obviously, in evaluation, there are a lot of assumptions that comes up in the evaluation. So we need to ensure that though we are not an expert, we will be able to look at the reasonableness of the assumption. We cannot say, I don't know, I am not an expert, and therefore I cannot look at the assumption. Yes, you are an auditor, and therefore your basic knowledge, understanding, experience gives you the capability to look at the appropriateness of the assumptions that has been used by the expert. So like I told you, you need to ask them why you have changed the methodology, if methodology has been changed, and you have to get an appropriate comfort on the answer from the answer that they're given. And finally, you have to look at the acceptability of the work that has been done by the expert. Sometimes the expert has done some work, you have reviewed it, you looked at it, and you are still not comfortable with this. Can you just completely reject it or accept it still because it is an expert who has done this? No, you can discuss it. You can raise the issues that you have. Maybe the expert will be ready to look at it and do some rework, or you may yourself be able to do some re-performance. For example, let us talk about the source data used. You're not very sure about the completeness and accuracy of the source data used. Perhaps you can yourself, with the help of your IT team, you can yourself look at the completeness and accuracy of the source data. So there are different ways to look at if you do not get a prima facie comfort on the work of the expert. This is also very important. Again, like in 610, the question is, can you use the work of expert in your audit report? Here, there is a slight difference between this and 610. the first question, the answer to the first question is no, you cannot use the work, you cannot refer to the work of the auditor's expert in your unmodified audit report. But if the reference is required by the law, certain references may be required by the law. In that case, you may refer to the use of the expert, but you must still make it explicitly clear to the reader that you have not the use of the expert and is not reducing your responsibility as the auditor. Yes, you can say the so and so violation has been done by so and so expert under the so and so regulations in the country or under the Companies Act. However, the use of this expert and the reliance on the expert does not absolve me as an auditor from the responsibility of the audit. That you have to always make it very clear. Suppose you are having a modified, you are coming out with a modified opinion, and the reason for the modified opinion may be perhaps because of certain valuations, or perhaps maybe because of certain feedback you got from the expert, that the expert has not agreed with certain accounting or certain conclusions of the entity. In that case, maybe in a rare circumstance, to make it very clear to the reader why you are modifying the audit report, you may be able to make some reference to the audit, to the expert, but again, you have to make it clear that this is a call that you have made based on certain expert, and you take the full responsibility, and you are not going to ask the expert to share your responsibility as an auditor. Okay, I think I am very clear to you. Now, if I am to sum up ISA 620, SA 620, I will say this essay deals with the use of expert other than in the field of accounting and auditing. That is very important. If it is in the field of accounting and auditing, like I said, management expert being used to prepare the financial statements, it is not coming under the purview of this standard. Auditor's responsibility is not reduced even if you rely on the work of an expert or use the work of an expert as an evidence. There is no compulsion on the auditor to use an expert. It is his call. He can take a call whether to use or not use. Auditor can use the expert used by the management. I already told they can use the expert used by the management, but it will come under SA 500. He has to, before he uses the work of an expert, he has to evaluate the competence, I said education, qualification, capability, the skills and experience, and the objectivity, unbiased nature of the activity of the expert. He should determine the appropriateness of the nature, timing, and extent of work for his purpose. The expert may be doing some work, but that may not be appropriate for him. He has to also decide whether what he is doing, the nature of work he is doing, the extent of work he is doing, and the timing of the work is appropriate for the purpose of his audit. He should conclude on the acceptability of the expert's work for the audit. Yes, we have to look at it and conclude, yes, this is the type of work I want, so I will use it. Or this is not definitely the work I wanted, though I had given him a lot of instructions, he has not done it, so it is not appropriate for me, so I will reject it. And like the last item, we have been saying, no reference to the use of an expert in the audit report that the external auditor issues. So that's all about the three standards that we have used. And I understand that there may be questions that you have. Please ask me and I'll try to give you the proper answer on this.
Yes, sir. 1 minute.
Selvan, I believe you are going to upload the questions, right?
Yeah, I'm just sharing it on screen. Sir. Is my screen visible?
Yeah. If each factory has separate financial information, financial statement, then factory is a component. Moreover, if the factory is audited by another auditor. Yes, I do agree. What is the question? If each factory has separate financial information, I told you, the first and most important criteria to see if it is a component is to see if they are preparing independent financial information. Then the factory is a component. Now, I want to just add something more here. yes, separate financial information is prepared, but they have not appointed a different component auditor. They are appointed the principal auditor as the auditor of this component also. Then also it is a component, or rather, the same firm or a network firm of the auditor is being appointed. That is in a large multinational environment. Maybe the component is being audited by a network firm of the principal auditor's firm. Then also the standard will apply. So even if it is part of the network, you have to treat that firm as a component, and all the procedures required under SA 600 have to be performed. I hope I have answered it properly. In all international financial markets, one auditor takes responsibility. However, in India, this does not occur. This is a serious deficiency with the ICAI SA 600 for Indian financial markets. See, I am not completely agreeing with this statement. I don't know why he has used the word one auditor takes the responsibility. In all international financial markets, the ISA, International Standards on Auditing, very clearly says the auditor, the principal auditor, the parent auditor is responsible for the audit of the components also. So this is a fundamental difference between our standard, Indian standards on auditing, and international standards on auditing on use of other auditor. Like I told you at the beginning of this discussion, the new international standards on auditing calls the header or the title of the new international standards on auditing ISA 600 is Special Considerations dash Audit of Group Financial Statements bracket including the work of component auditor. In fact, the work of component auditor is given a little priority. It says including the work of component auditor. The priority is special considerations in the audit of group financial statements. So it has changed. So it can be, there are many instances where two auditors are appointed as the auditor of the parent company, and when the component is audited only by one auditor, still the two auditors of the parent have equal responsibility on the audit of the component. I mean under international standards on auditing. In India, I don't know. I think for the Indian auditor, he has less risk, because if he has done his basic work, then he does not have to take responsibility for the audited financial statements of the component. That's about what he said. Now the next question is, as Indian stock markets are now growing, number 5 in the world as of today, in terms of market capitalization, thus how does ICAI plan to address this gap compared to international ISA 600? I am sorry, I am not an official of the ISA. I am not a member of this Central Council or the SIRC. I am not able to give an answer, but I can only point out that the current standard SA 600 that we use in India is quite old. It is 2 decades now. The standard, when I look at it, it says this standard will be effective from accounting periods beginning on or after 1st April 2002. So today is 4th April 2022. So it's 20 years. I also want to tell you one more thing. The international standards on group audit, or using the work of another auditor, was revised on 15 December 2009. And now I have read that this standard is again going to be revised. There is already a a draft memo issued on the standard, and the ISA or the IFAC is taking the opinion from the members from the accounting fraternity about, and the auditing fraternity about the provisions of the new standard. And hopefully soon, I think it is in the final stage, soon we will have one more revised standard on using the work of another auditor or other group audit, and we will still be, then we will be 2 standards behind. Unfortunately, I believe our leadership is aware of this, and they may have their own reasons for sticking on to the standard. I do not want to comment on that. What are the factors that hold back this development? I do not want to comment on that. I do not know. Sir, will production information not be treated as IP for financial reporting systems? If so, will it be important subject to all other factors being met for relaying the work of an internal auditor? I am not saying it will be important for, I am not saying it is not to be treated as an IP, it is to be treated as IP. When I gave an example, I was only saying that when the internal auditor is looking at only production related matters and not any matter that is connected to the preparation of the financial statement. That's all I'm saying. If it is something that is connected to the financial preparation of the financial statements that the internal auditor is looking at, then we can say the work of the internal auditor comes under the definition of internal audit under SA 610. So we have to look at the facts and take a call on that. And when you take a call on it, we have to properly document, give reasons why we have taken a call in X way or Y way, and that will absolve us from most of the liabilities. So it is not something it is not a black and white matter. It will always depend on the type of process or type of matter that we are looking at, and then we have to take a call on this. I'm not able to give a yes or no, but yes, if we are able to find that, if we are able to say or conclude that this IP has an important is an important factor in the preparation of the financial statement, of course, the internal auditor function work on this is to be counted as an internal audit. Use of an actuary is being done by auditors as a common practice. Yes. Use of FRM professionals for impairment assessment of receivables, etc. Yes. I don't know what is the question. It is a fact, especially with the introduction of, if I say, International Financial Reporting Standards 9. It is very important. It has become very complicated to do certain audits, particularly, the impairment of financial assets, the impairment of loans and receivables, the modeling for computing the impairment of loans and receivables. These all require specialists, and therefore the use of experts, which I already mentioned in my class, that the use of an expert is becoming more and more important for the audit fraternity. So my complaint when I was a practitioner was that my liberty to apply my auditing knowledge is coming down. Now, on many aspects, I have to rely on an expert. For example, valuation of real estate. In the earlier stages, I had to only obtain a proper valuation, study the valuation, look at the consistency, look at and see if it matches, if it relates to what is in the market, my knowledge of the market, and if I do not find anything which forces me not to believe it, I used to accept it. And of course, I had to document why I accepted it. But now that has changed. In most firms, at least large firms, the auditor is forced to use an expert who may be an internal expert or an external expert. Therefore, like in the case of real estate valuations, financial instruments valuations, and many cases, not only valuations, on impairment of loans and receivables, particularly in banks and financial institutions. In all this, the valuation of derivatives is another area where we have to use expert. Our expertise, our knowledge, though we believe is enough to make an understanding, unless it is a very complicated product. But nowadays, the general trend is to use specific experts, because I will also say it is because the regulatory bodies are very harsh on us when we do the audit, or the process we have played, the risk we have taken, the controls we have taken, and therefore the leadership of every audit firm believes it is better to use experts so that any complaint from the regulatory bodies can be avoided. So your question is correct. We are using professionals, but that is the way things are today. If a CFM is appointed to perform IT systems audit and management compliant with the rectifications and deficiencies reported, will the statutory audit rely on this matter as per SA? If a CFM is appointed to perform IT systems audit and management compliant with the reflections, yes. See, this is again, the standard is very clear when you can use the work of internal auditor. Just because it is a CFM who has done the work does not make that does not mean that we cannot rely on the work, because he has to be now considered as an internal auditor. I had earlier mentioned that an internal auditor may be an individual.
Sorry, your audio got disconnected. Sir.
These matters have to be seen. Everything that 610 asks us to do, we must perform, and then we must make a conclusion whether we can use that work for the purpose of external audit. I hope I've been clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Is there
Yes,
anything
sir.
else?
No, sir. We're done with all the questions, sir. And thank
Yeah.
you so much for your excellent session on standards on auditing, sir.
Thank you very much for all those members who have patiently listened to me. I enjoyed this session. I hope you have also enjoyed, and I'll appreciate if I can get a feedback from all of you on today's presentation. Thank you very much. And I don't know if it is proper for me to give my email ID.
No problem, sir. You can share it, sir. You can share it anyway. You can share it with us. We'll share it to the members so they can.
Okay. My email ID is msmatthew01.
I'll just type it out. So
msmatthew 01 at gmail.com. So those of you who have any questions or you want to communicate with me, you are free to communicate with me. And thank you once again. I am very happy to have been with my fraternity. In the last, I think it's almost 3 hours or 2.5 hours. I enjoyed this session. I hope you also enjoyed this session. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you so much, sir. We thank you on behalf of SIRC, Chairman, Secretary, and Vice Chairman who was there at the start for the introductory part, who couldn't join back at the end due to the other matters. Thank you so much.
I
appreciate. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
We'll share the feedback with you, so thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.